Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, as regular listeners will know, one of the recurring themes on the show is behavioural science and how it can help us to mitigate human risk. The idea being that if we're trying to influence people's behaviour to get them to do the things we want and not do the things we don't, then we really need to understand what drives human decision-making. On this episode, I'm exploring the history of behavioural science with the help of an academic who, unusually, has also been the president of a large private bank. Viswanathan Raghunathan, or Raghu as he likes to be known, is the author of a new book called Irrationally Rational, which looks at the development of behavioural science. Raghu calls it Behavioural Economics, but we're essentially talking about the same thing, through the work of 10 Nobel Laureates. In an engaging narrative, Raghu explores what each of them brought to the field and how their work is relevant in the modern world. So while this is a history of behavioural science, it's also a guide to help us understand different B-side concepts brought to life by examples that will be familiar to all of us. It's a bit like a travel guide. You're getting two things at once, some history and some practical insights that you can deploy today. Now, when I first read the book, I thought Raghu's aim was to make the research that's inspired the field more accessible to a general audience, which it is. But as you'll hear, there's more to it, because he's got a very specific audience in mind. And that's people in Raghu's home country of India, where behavioural science is a much younger discipline than it is in, say, Western Europe or the US. Now, I'm part of a global network of behavioural science advisors called Diversify. There's a link to that in the show notes, and I've got some colleagues from that in India. What they're doing is really exciting, because their approach to behavioural interventions is often very different to the way those of us in the Northern Hemisphere might approach them. It's a constant reminder to me of the benefits of cognitive diversity when it comes to problem solving. So in my discussion with Raghu, I also wanted to explore his perspective on the development of behavioural science in India. Raghu is not only very insightful, but he's also a lot of fun. So please enjoy my conversation with Raghu on something that describes all of us: irrationally rational. Raghu, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much. This is huge for me because from what I have seen of your podcasts, I really didn't expect that I would get a call from you one day. So here I am, delighted.
You are far too kind and far too modest, and as listeners will discover, you absolutely belong in the guest list of this because you've written something wonderful. But before we get into that, I'm fascinated by someone with your level of experience. What was your entry point into, I'll keep calling it behavioural science, you're referred to as behavioural economics, but we're talking about the same thing. What was the sort of entry, the gateway drug, if you like, that got you interested in it?
You see, I always hated economics. Though I was a professor of finance, my PhD was in finance, but economics was not for me, and I somehow never really liked it. And it turns out, but I didn't know at the time when I was writing my dissertation that my dissertation was in the area of behavioral finance, if you please, but which I realized only much later, as I've mentioned in the epilogue of the book. So it was somewhere there because I was obviously put off economics because it didn't quite sound very real to me, but it was all subliminal in my consciousness, maybe. Because I was never an economics student in my bachelor's and all. I did science and then MBA and so on. So I was essentially a finance student. But yes, once I started teaching finance and saw some papers in behavioral finance and so on, I started teaching a part of behavioral finance and behavioral economics at the Bocconi University in Milan as a visiting professor. I did it for almost 26 years non-stop.
Wow.
Now, of course, I've stopped my formal academic career as a full professor of finance at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, which, depending on, what sources you go by, but there are many, will say probably the most difficult business school in the world to get into. Harvard has a ratio of about 10 is to 1 number of applicants to the numbers admitted ratio. This school is something like 100 to 1. So because
Wow.
India is a huge country, so millions upon millions apply for these business schools, and only about 500, 400 get taken. So since I was teaching finance over there, and I used to summers, I used to go to Italy, to Milan, to teach behavioral economics. It was all latent learning. My last 10, 12 books were in all kinds of areas. One of my better known books is Games Indians Play, where I used a game theoretic framework to explain the Indianness of the Indians, so to speak. Why do we jump queues? Why do we litter the streets? And things like those. Basically, the idea was to show a mirror to ourselves, our ugly side, our warts and moles, and so on. So there was a part of behavioral economics which had come there through the game theory route and so forth. Then I also wrote a book in the allied field called The Good Indian's Guide to Queue Jumping. You know where it's leading, for instance. So some of my books had this element of behavioral economics there, though not all of them. So during this COVID time is when one of the books that I was writing, the book that I wanted to write was something else, but what was coming out was something else altogether. So it was in this dichotomy that I was a little frustrated, and I wondered, okay, now what the heck? Why can't I put it aside and think afresh? And then I was taking stock of, okay, I've written 10 books, so a lot of whatever was in my stock, so to speak, has already gone out, and it's getting pretty empty. I had to scrape the barrel, so to speak. So I wondered what to do. And then I realized that at least 60 to 70% of the key literature in behavioral economics over the years I had read up. So I was largely familiar with the major works in behavioral economics. I won't say even as a percentage it may be nothing, but the Kahnemans of the world, the Taylors of the world, the Schillers, the Eckerloffs, all these people I had read reasonably well. So I said, hey, how about a book on behavioral economics? But then guys way bigger than me have written amazing books in behavioral economics. And what is it that I was going to say that others hadn't already said? And there are some amazing textbooks available, and then there are these whole niche books, and then there are books with the whole research works, the entire body of works by Kahneman and Tversky and so on. So I said, what am I going to do? And that's when, in an aha moment, so to speak, that is the flip side of COVID. You get a lot more time to reflect, which in the normal humdrum life you never get to reflect deeply enough. But here I said, hey, wait a minute, not one of them. You see, most leading experts have written the books based on their own researches. Textbooks indeed had talked about many others, but that was again in terms of the topics in behavioral economics. So I said, why don't I? I could off my head recall 6 or 7 Nobel laureates for whom behavioral economics was cited in their Nobel prizes. So when I formally checked up, in the last 40 years, there were about 10 Nobel laureates whose works had been cited in the field of behavioral economics, who had been acclaimed for Nobel in economics. So I said, why don't I sequence the works around the Nobel laureates' works? Because to some extent, the pattern of the Nobel Prize also follows the pattern of the development of the field in some ways, though not strictly, but largely. So that's how I started with Herbert Simon, then Gary Becker, and all the rest of them were covered in the book. And that was the theme. So I had a hanger now to hang the book on, because otherwise I wasn't finding a peg all the time.
And so you've had this revelation, and I mean you've gone right for the top here, as you suggested, right? Which is, let's have the Nobel laureates, because,
That's right.
put it in very simple terms, they know what they're talking about, right? This is acclaimed stuff, and let's go with the real experts here.
So it was organically building up, starting from neoclassical economics, ending at today's behavioral economics. Each one contributed at the margin. So I thought I could bring that story out, and that's why I called it the scripting of the story by the 10 Nobel laureates.
You've got this sort of rough outline, and I guess the way I looked at it is you're sort of saying, okay, let's distill down what they're covering and tell, as you say, tell the individual story of what they were doing and what they were looking at, and then move into that broader piece.
That's,
And
that's right.
it would be remiss of me to suggest that this was just a summary of their research. What you've tried to do is pull the key points out and to take us on a journey as to what they were discovering. And the bit that I really liked was that it wasn't just sort of slavish repetition. You add your own thoughts and insights. And one of the things that I really liked was you take anecdotes and pieces of research and you modernize them and make them relevant to a modern audience. So a good example would be COVID gets added in, which doesn't change the underlying dynamic, but makes it much more salient. And so you were, as I saw it, telling the story, but also refreshing aspects of it that would make it more salient to a modern day audience.
Yeah, you have actually summed it up pretty well, because you see, the one problem about writing on economics, for instance, even with this book, my first version, the first draft that I wrote, uh, my publishers at Penguin told me that this is more the Oxford University Press pattern. So it was too serious, very heavy, no jokes, so it was all very dense. They said you need to lighten it. And that's where the real challenge really came in. Because once you have written something, then to reorient it in a different frame of mind is certainly a difficult situation. And but their suggestion made sense, because as it is, COVID wasn't the happiest of times, so to speak. Then you put a dense book on top of people and expect them to read. And India, we say India is an English speaking country, but English speaking population is barely 4 to 5%, of which probably only 1 or 2% would really be reading books on economics and books of these kinds. It's not like the Western market, where I've seen in UK, in your country, for instance, I've seen a cab driver reading a book on finance, which I read as well. No, that's not the case in India. So the readership is very, very small, for instance. So unless I lightened it, I would be shrinking it even further. So I had to think about lightening the mood during this time. So it's a purely a COVID period book. It was conceived during COVID, it was written during COVID, and it has been published during COVID. So yeah, so COVID had a huge role there for sure.
And there's something really interesting about the way that you've done that, because actually that is in itself recognizing the dynamics of behavioral economics, right? Which is recognizing what are real human beings likely to want to read. And so
That's
you've really gone through, put yourself, as one, if one is looking at behavioral interventions, it's thinking, how can I move the target audience to behave in a particular way? So there's something nice about the substance and the form coming together, in the sense that you've had to think about the readership and view things from their perspective and take things that I guess if you kept them at the sort of research level might not be something that people would find salient. And so you've pulled it into that zone and saying, I'm going to speak to you in language you'll understand. So you don't, in simple terms, need
that's
to be an academic to read this.
in fact, that itself is a element of behavioral understanding of people about economic decision making. In the sense, people make economic decisions all the time, but if you tell it to them without bringing the human beings into the picture, they can't quite relate to it. But the moment, in fact, that was in a way the shortcoming of the classical economics as well, because as I've said in the book, and I keep repeatedly, I try to bring that to the fore, that neoclassicists assumed a behavior and imposed it upon people, saying people behave as if these are the attributes which govern their decision making. While the behavioral economists brought the psychology and economics together, the early pure economists used to look down upon behavioral sciences. Or psychology was psychology, it had nothing to do with economics. And if people didn't behave the way the classical economics postulated people to behave, then they weren't worth studying. They were irrational, they were not worth studying. So, but if you want to, there's also a lot of behavioral economic research which says a story certainly sticks much more than data, for instance. So unless you tell it in a story form, unless you tell them how the classicist economists have been modified, it's not that classical economists didn't make sense. There was enormous amount of sense. They had to make those simplifying assumptions to bring out larger theories. But how to bring it closer to people, how will people get interested? Today behavioral economics is being taught in electives in schools, forget colleges. So economics has suddenly become sexy, uh, partially because of behavioral economics, for instance. So I had to bring that into the book itself, and I'm glad that somebody like you thinks that I have partially at least succeeded. So it's a huge thing for me.
You've definitely more than partially succeeded. But can you talk about this idea of modernizing some of the anecdotes and the findings?
Yes.
Because on the face of it, I will just say something like, "Oh, well, all we need to do is update that for COVID."
Yeah.
But actually, one of the things I think is interesting is taking something that was salient at the time it was written for that particular audience isn't just simply a case of, well, I'm just going to search and replace on words.
Yeah.
You've got to start thinking about the underlying dynamics. How did you go about that?
That was in some ways easy for me, because when I was talking about irrationally rational, which is the main title of the book, irrationally rational. Now, merely by citing the papers of the Nobel laureates, I couldn't really drive home what was meant by irrationally rational. People are irrational as per the neoclassicist economists. However, if that irrationality is inherent to human beings, and if the same irrationality is found among doctors and engineers who build our bridges, doctors who do our heart transplants, if they are irrational, then, well, either we have something else to worry about, or that irrationality is rationality. So one, no, this idea could not be communicated without stories. Now, fortunately, India is a fascinating country with all its warts and moles. There is not a moment of boredom. If you're just looking around, there are examples galore. Sitting where I'm sitting, I live in a gated community of independent houses, and I can find people who don't clean up after their dog poop, for example. Okay. Or, I've lived through communities where the guy living on the ground floor very rationally, and that is what neoclassicists say, that you are a rational human being is selfish, or at least self-interested. So a guy living on the ground floor will defy paying for the lift maintenance, because he would say, but I don't use the lift, so why should I pay for the lift maintenance? All right. So India is a country full of examples, and also because it was being published not by Penguin US or Penguin UK, but by Penguin India. It will going to US and so on, but that will be with a lag. But the key publisher is Penguin India. I had to find Indian examples so that our people could relate to it, maybe make that little dent somewhere to lead them into thinking, hey, wait a minute, I'm not paying this, but there is a book where I vaguely recall reading about this. Maybe this is not right. And also, Government of India, for instance, has set up a cell of behavioral economics under the Ministry of Finance, where various kinds of nudges can be used, and so on. So they have set up a nudging cell, for instance. In fact, in our own city in Bangalore, for instance, at various crossings, you can see mannequins dressed as policemen, and it does nudge the behavior of the unruly traffic to a degree. Similarly, some areas where there were large potholes, which I live in Bangalore, so where the Bangalore municipality was not being sufficiently responsive, an artist created a 12-foot alligator and placed it in front of that pothole, and it immediately caught the attention of everyone. It was a huge nudge, so to speak, for the entire press covered it, and within 24 hours that pothole had been cleared up and so forth. So one is beginning to see some of the advantages of the applications of behavioral economic principles. So I found it quite easy to a lot of Indian contexts which I could find, and especially because I had the Indian audience who were relatively less literate in this field as compared to the Western audience who have been probably been reading a lot more. And I also wanted all of it in one book so that they don't need to read 25 books to get to the same place. So that was the whole idea.
And I think that's really, really interesting. I guess I just missed that because I was approaching it from my own perspective. And I just thought, oh, he's modernized it. But that's a really interesting perspective where you're saying actually you are
I've Indianized it.
right. And I think, and by the way, I'm very excited about the growth of this in India and other countries. Because I think one of the challenges, and I would be interested in your views on this a second, is that obviously it's been driven heavily by kind of northern hemisphere countries, and can name the obvious ones. And therefore, we've come up with some interesting ideas. But that's very much framed in our own context. And the thing I think is going to be really cool is when we get some brand new case studies that will be infused with a very different way of thinking about things. Now, some of those things absolutely won't work in our context, and we'll smile and be
Yes.
bemused as to why they would work somewhere else. But that's part of the joy of it. But I think there are going to be some
Yeah.
amazing ideas coming out where it'll be turning logic on its head and conventional logic on its head in ways that we haven't thought of yet. So for me, this is
Yes.
really exciting to see. And I wondered, can you talk a little bit about the growth of it in India and what you're seeing? Because I think from certainly from where I'm sitting, I know it's going on, and I've got colleagues in that space. But I'd be very interested to see how you see it and where the sort of development curve is.
You see, the only problem with India is, we are great with ideas, but not equally great with implementations of ideas. So yes, we have made a start, but that percentage which is working in the field is minuscule actually. Also, research is not very endemic to India in the sense we often borrow research, even R&D in the industry. If you look at it in terms of the percentage of GDP spent on R&D and so on, India, as among the less developed countries, is not highly research oriented either in academia or in industry. But things are changing. But you see, when you talk about 1.3 billion people, changes are bound to be slow. Okay. And then there are the other elements, the whole sludge, as you call it, of the entire huge political machinery, the corrupt machinery, the bureaucracy, and all of it put together. The changes are bound to be relatively slow in these fields. But I'm happy that the younger generation, especially in the cities, kind of uppity schools, which are probably, again, by numbers, they may be 5% or 10% in the country in terms of total number of schools. But youngsters are getting interested, and one only hopes that in the next 10 to 20 years, one will be able to see some of it rolling down into the ground and making a difference to our lives.
And so implicitly, the book, if I sort of think about that desire on your part to see that happen, implicitly the book is helping to drive that, where you want to get people interested, excited by it,
Yes,
speed them up the curve a little bit, give them the history and the background, and sort of almost turbocharge that development. Is that a fair way to look at it?
absolutely. I think you put it better than I did. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. You see, I quit formal academia, full time academia, almost 20 years ago. Then I went to head a bank, a large bank in India. I was the president for 4 or 5 years. Then I was heading a very large foundation of one of the biggest infrastructure companies in the country for 15 years. Then I was director of the Schulich School of Business, which is based in Toronto. They had an India campus. I was the director till 2 years ago. So I have not been into full time academics. So I don't do direct research anymore, but I'm expecting that a book like this will help young researchers to hypothesize certain of these findings in the Indian context and, strengthen the body work of behavioral economics in the less developed countries context. Because there are cultural differences, even in behavioral economics. Of course, at one level, one can say if a drug works on rats, we say it should work on humans. So one can say if it works on Americans, it should work on Indians. But human beings, you know, but human beings are cultural beings. So what may work in a West, like tipping, for example, is very different in the American culture versus in Japanese culture versus Indian culture, for example. So the same findings that you find in US will not work in Japan or in India, for instance, because tipping cultures are very different. So behaviorally, I think that we need a vast body of work in the Indian context itself. And I'm hoping that a book like this will incite that interest among the readers, and the younger, especially researchers, will find some new ideas to hypothesize and
But,
test out.
what I find really interesting about what you've just described is it's deeply ironic because we reckon anybody if you spend any time looking at behavioral science economics, you start to recognize that the theory we spot pretty quickly the theory doesn't always work in practice, and so we recognize we need to challenge that. And then what happens when you roll out behavioral interventions is often we make the same mistake, which is we've now okay, it wasn't that economics thing that was clearly flawed, but we've sussed it out now. We've worked out the weaknesses in the economic model, and we've now got the answer. And I love the fact that what you just basically pointed out is go, hold on, let's not make the same mistakes again. We need to keep and of course it's not just a case of saying once we've solved the US problem, we're done. We've got to keep refreshing that one because human beings respond to
That's
it. But
right.
I love this idea of sort of going, well, we may be able to roll it out again, but we can't say for sure until we've tested it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and also, we need a greater research culture. Obviously, somebody sitting in the West will find subjects only in their own country. Why would somebody from US come to India and find subjects over here to do research? So the onus is on us to build that, and that's why I thought a book like this, coming from this part of the world, adds greater value to our own population because examples are Indian and possibilities are Indian, so forth. So that was the whole idea. You put
And
it very well.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by your thoughts around global companies, and I'll talk about ones coming into India, and then we can look at the ones sort of coming out because there's a mindset I think in lots of large global organizations that is sort of well we have one culture and one business and we want consistency across the globe and that makes perfect sense in a customer service perspective. So McDonald's is successful around the globe because there's a certain consistency of standard. You know what to expect. They follow they localize it, but they follow similar procedures. And what I think is interesting is that many organizations approach the way they're trying to influence their employees. I think companies are sort of think about customers in local markets, and so if there's a behavioral intervention, an advertisement, for example, or some sort of marketing attempt, there will be some effort gone into think about well, what would work in this market. But if we look at other attempts to influence people, uh, things, for example, that are deployed on employees, often that same level of thought, the tailoring to this specific local market, doesn't happen. And one of the things I think is interesting is that what the shift that you're talking about should change is suddenly we can start to say, actually, we're building up a body of work now where, look, international company, if you're coming into India or you're already there, imposing your model on us isn't always going to work. And you need to be thinking about locally inspired ideas that might actually flips on be better ways of solving things from a global perspective. So what I might term as sort of behavioral economics imperialism, a presumption that your way is the right way. And I wondered, is that a fair sort of assessment about some of the things that we see larger companies do, particularly internally?
Uh, yeah, I would say some of it is true, but that's more because of inertia. You're used to doing certain things in your country with your own people from your part of the world in a certain way, and that inertia carries forth even when you operate outside your own nation. But at the same time, increasingly many of the companies are beginning to appoint behavioral experts in their HR teams and so forth to try and tailor make some of their policies more suited to the culture that they are operating in. Now, yes, obviously the speed of adjustment will is bound to be slow. It's not reasonable to expect that one. The transition will happen very rapidly. I think one has to be realistic about it. But as long as today also, one positive thing also is like you see, if you take Microsoft or if you take IBM and so on, they have Indian CEOs, for instance. So obviously, when these big countries operate in India, they can't not be cultural sensitive and so forth. So cross culturally, if there's a Chinese CEO in US or a US CEO in China and so forth, I think part of that happens with that osmosis itself. But beyond that, I think it's not a deliberate thing by any company not wanting to change, but it is an inertial force which they carry on from what they've been doing. And it's taking a bit of time because also operating in a new culture, you also have other challenges to really, navigate through. So I would think that this cultural shift in understanding whether it is advertisements, whether it is consumer behavior understanding, or whether it is labor relations, labor contracts, or even inter trade relations. how the kind of contracts, moral hazard problems in a developing country versus in a developed country. Dealing with India may not be the same as dealing with Germany for a US company, for instance, and so forth. So, yes, these sensitivities, they are business compulsions. I don't think they can afford to let it go for very low. But I think the direction is in the right direction. The speed we may believe could be faster, but I think these things do take time. You know, so you have to be
Right.
patient.
And I mean, thinking about that adjustment piece and your Indianification, if you like, of some of the sort of the research and the stories that come from it. Was there anything that was sort of more obviously challenging where you had to work a little bit harder? In other words, where were the sort of bigger gaps between what you had seen coming out of the research and what you wanted to write in the book?
That's a difficult question to answer, because you see what happens is when you are reading a researcher, he's already giving you an example, and therefore you are a little bounded within that context of example. It's very, the original thinker has a very vast canvas, but once he puts that story into you, for you to think outside that story becomes a huge challenge. And that was a huge problem for me to find Indian examples to fit the same context. At the same time, it had to be uh, because these are anecdotal stories, so one has to tread a little carefully, not generalizing that at the same time, and yet trying to bring those findings closer to the Indian audience. So it was, at no point of time was it easy, especially when you talk about availability bias, or greed and fear kind of differences, or treatment of unfairness. You see, in less developed countries, we take a lot of unfairness in our stride,
Right.
which will somebody in Germany or somebody in Switzerland will not brook for a second, for instance. So to find counter examples in the Indian context, I had to think, but then I had COVID to keep me company, so I had all the time in the world. I had all the time in the world.
So there's an interesting thing here, which is you're trying to retain the authenticity of the original and not stray too far from that.
Yes,
But at the same time, you're thinking, well, this has got to land with them. And so I'm going to need to depart a little bit, possibly, to make it land.
that's right. Absolutely. Well put. Prettily put.
As I looked at what you'd written, and as you say, it's individual chapters dealing with individual Nobel laureates and their I'll use a very loose term, schools of thought and research and findings. Was the order that you tackled it in, was that easy to do it? Did you consider other orders?
I did actually. You see, I looked at you see, when you look at works done, who's early, whose work is earlier than whose, see, there are always overlaps, in the sense his works start from 1950, go up to 1970. Somebody else started in 1956 but went up to 1981. Okay.
Right.
So some works are earlier, some works are later. So I thought I will broadly keep the theme of who got the earlier Nobel Prize.
Mhm.
And it turns out that in most cases, they were also the older Nobel laureates by age. And their works tended to be earlier. And yet, towards the end, I shift. I put Thaler ahead of Schiller, for example. Schiller got it along with Fama and what's his name? Pence. Three of them got it, but only Schiller was the Nobel laureate. Sorry, he was the only behavioral economics Nobel laureate. So he had 1/3 share of the Nobel Prize. So I put him after Thaler, though his Nobel is before Thaler. Okay.
Yep.
So broadly, it is in the order of getting the Nobel Prize. But I did flip towards the end. So that was a irrationally rational thing to do, I thought.
And the thing we didn't pick up actually was some of the in the introduction. You beautifully talk about the logic for your approach and the sort of retrofit some behavioral economics there. Can you talk about the rationale that you've used? Because it's sort of beautifully worded, and I won't do it justice if I try and summarize it, but I thought it was a really nice touch to frame the exercise in that context.
Yes. You see, that there were several issues that I had to worry about. As I said, going by topic was out because there are, hundreds of topics that you can think of. And talking about this bias or that bias, and then going to and fro with the researchers obviously didn't make sense. But even when you talk about Nobel laureates, the question is, most Nobel laureates are polymaths. They have done works in several fields, and even after getting the Nobel Prize, they have been very active in one field or the other. So there was this whole challenge of which works to capture. I thought, okay, broadly, I will capture the works of the Nobel laureates till they got the Nobel Prize or a little thereafter, but not too much. For instance, if somebody got a Nobel Prize in 1997, I was not looking too much into their works done in 2015, for instance.
Right.
I stopped with, because I was talking about how the bridge between neoclassical economics and behavioral economics was built. Therefore, subsequent developments were less important. They were more like structures on top of the bridge, not the bridge itself. So I did that. Then there was a question of, there are Banerjee and Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Now, are they behavioral economists in my definition, or should I not include them? This was a huge debate in my mind because there are as many reasons to include them as I could think of not to include them. I thought at one level they had done a lot of work which rub shoulders with the works in behavioral economics. But at the same time, I thought they were using a methodology which is conducive to behavioral economics, but they were more of social economists or sociologists rather than questioning the premise of the classical economists to turn them into behavioral economics. Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo had basically used experimental methods, which is also used by behavioral economists in their developmental economics framework. So, with all that debate in my mind, I decided not to include him, which is huge because he's an Indian.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Right.
He's an Indian. And that is a element, there's a tongue. Oh my God, he's an Indian. I'm an Indian. I'm writing the book in India. Should I exclude him? But finally, I thought I should, maybe I did the irrationally rational thing. I excluded him. So there were things of these kinds. And similarly, again, when you're writing a book in India, if I write rupee such and such, rupees means nothing to somebody living in UK or US.
Right.
He doesn't even know how many rupees is it to a dollar. At the same time, if I write dollar, it sounds very, very artificial that I'm writing a book with Penguin India, largely for the Indian authorship with Indian examples. And what is dollar doing over there? So I use that international symbol, which is like a zero with cross. I said, look, you can add a zero, or if it's a yen, you can add a zero. If it's dollar, you can subtract a zero, and you use that denomination as per your own country, and that also makes it region neutral. Somebody reading in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran or Iraq has no problem with it because it's a very neutral kind of a symbol. So that there were, and yes, there are other challenges when you write in the Indian context is spellings. Like behavioral, the UK spelling which India uses typically is IOURAN, behavioral.
Mm-hmm.
US will not use the U. It's it's a HIORAN. Okay, behavioral. Now, where I use the word behavioral myself, it has to have a U. But if it is a reference of a US text or a paper, it should not have the U. Okay. So I had to be very careful about things like this. So these are all the little challenges in writing a book like this, which was, also when you're trying to use the example of a Nobel laureate, how can I add an extra zero? I should not. Okay. Because I'm using the example as it is. It is referred as such. So there were challenges of these kinds, which finally I managed to do whatever I did. And as I said, ultimately all bloopers are mine. So there you are.
But that's really interesting because again, this is a sort of perception issue. Is I'm thinking about what the reader is going to be thinking, and the to you or not to you in behavioral is something I struggle with because I clearly as a Brit I should absolutely put it in there, but frankly I can't justify its existence. It doesn't seem to me to add anything in terms of our understanding or the pronunciation of the word, but nonetheless I still have to dogmatically
Right.
include it to avoid critique from there. But I think what you've talked about there is really interesting because that is the challenge in essence of getting to the audience is thinking about, well, what are they going to be feeling as they go through this, and how do I make sure this lands?
Uh, since I also explained some of it in the preface, but usually people don't read prefaces, is my experience. Because even I skip prefaces at times, in some of the books. So people don't read prefaces. But because so if without reading that, they sudden if they come across that some strange symbol for currency, at least in the one or two initial places, I put a footnote just to draw their attention. Okay. So I would imagine that someone who's not a very habitual reader may have some hiccups, but habitual readers will understand it very quickly, so it will not be a huge challenge. But at the same time, what I've done is I've created an appendix for some of the more jargon-oriented, heavier kind of subjects where we needed some annexure. For instance, when you talk about mean variance framework or when you talk about the rational expectations principles. Now, when you use this, people have no clue what you're talking about if one is a general reader. Economic students will probably understand. So I've simplified these in the annexure also. So for a lay reader, I think the book has been made as simple as possible. In fact, the book is not meant for experts. I would go so far as to say that truly the behavioral economists will probably have relatively less takeaway. But the book is a popular book. It's not meant for experts. It's meant for general readers.
I'm tempting fate here, but and clearly some of them are no longer with us. But in terms of the laureates that you have covered that are still around, so Kahneman would be an example. And have you had any sort of feedback from their camps or disciples or anything about the way that you have summarized what they've?
Well, I did write to Professor Kahneman. I didn't get a response back, but then again, I would only blame myself because I'd sent him an early draft, which he must have laughed off. So he must have thought in some really nut from India claiming my time. And obviously, I will understand because he has so much more, so much more to do than responding to everybody who writes to him. And I'm sure millions of those like us write to him. But yes, like from Chicago, Mulainathan, who's a very well known behavioral economist himself, who's also referred to in the book, he works with a lot of well known researchers. He himself is a very well known researcher. He's the author of one of his famous books. Which one is it? Not Grit. There's a well-known book. For the time being, it escapes my mind. So he has given an endorsement for the book. Professor Viral Acharya of New York University has given an endorsement for the book. S.P. Kothari of MIT has given an endorsement for the book. Couple of our own Reserve Bank governors have endorsed the book and so forth. Economic Times editor emeritus has similarly Indian Planning Commission vice chairman has given an endorsement. So with the people whom the book went to did find it of use and found it value additive. But yes, I didn't write to any other Nobel laureate, to be honest, because I thought it's an unfair claim on their time even to attempt.
Right, right. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I wasn't expecting there to have been any, but I was just intrigued as to whether, it's often possible when you have other people looking at something you've done, particularly through a new light, that
Yeah.
interpretation adds something that you hadn't originally thought of, or possibly hadn't even intended.
Yeah, but the book was just released at the beginning of this month. So if at all somebody is likely to get back,
Right.
that will be the day. I'll wait for it.
And as you went through this journey, were there any things that sort of jumped out at you that you hadn't sort of focused on before that you found particularly revealing or fascinating? Because I'm really I tend to find if you come back to things, you may see it in a different light. And I wondered as you were going through and sort of review, almost revising in the nicest possible sense your previous perspectives on these things? Was there anything that came out of that was sort of surprised you? Things that perhaps resonated more now than had originally, or that you sort of had sort of glossed over before, perhaps, and suddenly found were deeper or more informed than you might have thought?
Fortunately, not. In fact, surprising, no, that could be a reason here because since the book was published or released or whatever we call it, I've been very busy with this and that, some talks here and some chats there, and uh, you know, some reviews coming over and so on. So I haven't really had time to seriously reflect on what I could have done differently or what more I could have added. Yes, except that Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo conflict in my mind, which yes, at one level maybe I could have said, okay, I could have added. It would have made the book fatter, but the fatter the economics book, the less the readership.
Right,
So
right, right.
you also got to worry about that. As it is, it's a 300-page book. If it becomes a 400-page book, I'll halve the readership. But anyway, that apart. But the only things are, of course, there are always a few, half a dozen bloopers in the first edition that goes through, and which I have been working overtime to correct, so that the next reprint, which should be coming out soon, will, especially the paperback, will have addressed all of them. Many of them may not even be caught by every reader, but some readers will catch some, I'm sure. And that is always an embarrassment because somehow, when you as an author identify a blooper, you think the whole world is looking at nothing but that one blooper in the entire book. And sure, that's disconcerting, but that's part and parcel of the excitement or whatever of writing a book. So, but otherwise, there have been no major shocks. There have been no major revelations that I should have done something very differently. But yes, of course, anything can be improved. It's a cliche to say that, but yeah, no big surprises anyway.
Obviously, you're talking about revisions for the next edition when that comes out. What's on the game plan after that? Are you continuing? Are you going to do more of a similar thing? Have you got what's the next research or writing project?
I already have another book being worked on with Penguin, which is more on education, actually. You see, I don't write on the same genre repeatedly. In fact, if you look at my website, you look at all my books, they're all mostly on very, very different kind of themes. So the one on education talks more in terms of, we call it basically what is not taught in the educational system or even by parents. For instance, how and when do we make our children aware that the world is not necessarily a fair place, or that the world is not necessarily an equal place, or that the world will never have its share of bullies, or that that adversity is very much a part of life and you got to learn to deal with it. You can't keep on protecting a child's life as if adversity can be done away with forever. So how do how do you teach a child how to make judgments about what is right and what is wrong? Especially in a corrupt country. India is one of the more corrupt countries in the world. So child sees corruption all around. So how do you make them sensitive to what is right and what is wrong? How do you think about your higher responsibilities in life? uh, you know, in other words, education is not about getting that first job or cracking that Ivy League school, but creating a good citizen. And all these elements go with that maturity. And do parents and teachers teach this, or do they take only they take refuge in the fact that 60% of our children went to Ivy League schools? That is what they advertise, on the boards. That
Right.
so many out of 60 students who passed the secondary school certificate, 43 have made it to Ivy League schools in the US and UK. Now, if that's the only way you're going to assess education, then there is a bit of a problem. Then we are creating test smashers, but not necessarily mature citizens. So this book is along that journey with anecdotal examples and so forth, stories and so.
And I think that's really interesting because you've touched on a very simple thing to understand, which is ethics, and yet a
Yeah.
very complicated thing to do in practice. So the thing is, it's a sort of
Yeah.
it's really easy to explain, but very very difficult in practice.
Very difficult to address it. Yeah. So this is a book my wife and I are doing together because she's also an author. So this is our first and the only book that we've ever collaborated on, or anything that we've collaborated on.
Wow, and how's that going? That must be really interesting.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm subservient. So there you are. So no clashing.
Well, the bit I find interesting about that exercise is that obviously you're going into quite a lot of detail that would might go beyond the sorts of conversations that a husband and wife would normally have. And so you're in a way you're revealing some of the deeper, darker thoughts that you have in a very sort of public exercise. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah. But what we do is we sit in our own rooms and exchange the drafts with each other. So more than talking it over, we do it straight on the draft. So we track change and so on. And then if there is a serious difference in opinion and the changes made, then we talk it over. Otherwise, it's pretty smooth, it just goes to and fro. So there isn't a problem.
So you're not fighting over the keyboard.
No, we don't. And actually, she's the smarter of the two of us, so I usually listen to her.
very, very diplomatic. I will make no further comment, but
Very honest.
that's excellent. And look, Raghu, if there was one lesson from the book that you have not the one that's coming, but the one you've just published for people to take away, what would that be?
The one message to take away from Irrationally Rational is think when you make economic choices. Think about the biases or heuristics that you may be using, because a conscious, thoughtful, or mindfulness of taking the decision can improve the quality of your decision. And that is what comes out through the book, through this debate between classical economists and behavioral economics.
Wow, I love that. There was a pause there, and I thought, "Oh, what's he going to come up with?" And actually, I love that. I mean, again, it's very simple. Again, hard to do sometimes in practice, but
Hard to do.
I love the idea of sort of putting it in very simple terms. Just check yourself before you jump into things.
That's right. Be mindful of the biases and heuristics that you use, which can lead you astray sometimes. So better be careful. You'll make better decisions.
That leads me to another final question: is you talk about before you make economic decisions. Of course, in the same way, actually, as ethical decisions, these things don't often come neatly badged. There isn't a sort of big arrow that comes down from the sky, go ethical or economic alert, right? Be alert. These things stealth on us, and we might not even recognize them.
That's
And so that makes this quite challenging in a way. So, is your advice? Well, actually, it's worth stepping back for every decision. Now, clearly we can't do that, but how do we sort of recognize, to put it in very crude terms, how do we recognize an economic decision when we come across one?
no. That's why I've given some examples. For instance, even in my own society, I sometimes find when a house falls vacant, the landlord, who may be living in the US but he has a house in our gated community, they wait for several months, if required, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, to get a certain level of rental that they have in mind as a preconceived notion, that it should not be less than the previous rental that they were getting. Even if the market has gone down because of COVID, people are not really moving around much. For various reasons, the market is down, but they will not rent it out, for instance. So a book like this makes them think that, hey, wait a minute, am I not losing money for 7 months? So even if I get a next 2-year contract, what I'm losing here will not necessarily make up for it if I don't accept a slightly lower rate. So, thinking along those lines, it becomes a little more conscious choice now. So that's the hope that I have, that even when where it's an ethical choice or economic choice, at least Paul, Kahneman would call it shift your system one thinking to system two thinking, for example. It's the same thing. Pause a little, be a little more mindful of what you're doing, and yeah, use a pen on the back of an envelope if required, but try and take a more informed choice. So that's what it's talking about. And that's what I hope this book will do.
I love that. So I'm going to put links to your website and all of your books in the show notes, but give us that one final reminder of what your book is called, who it's published by, and where people can find it.
Irrationally Rational. 10 Nobel Laureates script the story of behavioral economics. That's the book. And it is the story of the 10 Nobel laureates, how they built brick by brick upon neoclassical economics to build behavioral economics. That's what the book is.
Amazing. Well, I think, Raghu, as people will tell from the conversation, I think you bring a very fresh, sparky perspective to things. And so far from being a sort of history book of behavioral economics, it does cover that. It does talk about what happens, but it provides a very fascinating angle. And now that you've given me a different lens through which to read, I'm going to go back in and have a look at how some of these things that I had assumed were just modernizations are actually making it relevant for India. So that's a new way for me to reread the book again. But I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation on the podcast. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Likewise. In fact, it's been such an honor and such a delight chatting with you. And it's been a great pleasure and to have made a new friend and, as a bonus to boot. So thank you very much for the honor and for the privilege. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Raghu for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Raghu, his work, and his book, Irrationally Rational, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do. It really, really does help. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients and the Diversify network that I am part of, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, remember we're irrationally rational, and thanks for listening.